Welcome to episode 7 of Foundational Foundry, the tutorial series from the Foundry Roundtable. I'm Green Dragoon, and with me are my unflappable co-hosts, Drogon1701,
Hello.
Duncan Idaho,
Adley.
and Mark Harkman.
Hey.
Alright, in the last episode we began work on an introductory mission of sorts designed to highlight the various aspects of the Foundry in action. We began with the first map, a space map set in the Trimble system. Today we will continue our work and lay down some enemies for the player to fight, as well as establishing some objectives for the player to complete. So let's start by placing some enemy groups that we're going to need for this map. So let's go ahead. What did we decide on? We decide Orions, Nausicaans.
I think Orions are fine.
Okay, so we need an NPC group. Orion squad. So I'm thinking a frigate group will work.
For starters.
And you can see here that each group comes with a number of NPCs.
And just as a note on those, not all of those will be actually deployed. They are all the NPCs that could potentially show up if the maximum scaling is applied. That's
Sure.
You have a full team of players coming in. So the one thing about this is that they're not actually labeled which ones will actually show up. A frigate group will only spawn three of those units. It'll be the same 3, but you won't necessarily know unless you play the mission. There's a few resources out there that will have gone through and labeled which units come into play. But one little trick I do is I'll actually number these guys off. So I'll go into each individual unit, open up their properties, which you can use to modify their coordinate position, and also change their costume if you want to try changing things around using custom ships and all that. But I'll actually just number these guys off. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, and so on. And then I'll just make a note of which ones actually showed up of that group, like say 1, 3, and 4. And then I know those ones are the ones that are going to be spawned. So I'll play around with their position, change the costumes as necessary, and so on. So there's little tricks to get around that limitation. But for a lot of these default squadrons, especially if you're not planning on changing their custom appearance, it's not necessary. You just note that, well, only 3 of these guys are going to be showing up.
So there was actually a guide that very nicely broke down which NPCs would show up depending on which number of players there were. And unfortunately, that was hosted on Starbase UGC, which is currently experiencing technical difficulties. I'm hoping they can get it back up and running and cover that guide because it was very useful. But yeah, unfortunately, we're kind of left to fend for ourselves for the moment. Okay, so I've got this group, but I want them to be attacking a Federation freighter. And so we need to do a little bit of a trick to get this to work. So I'm actually going to call up a cruiser group, a Federation cruiser group. And I'm just going to place it right here in the middle. Now remember, you see a bunch of NPCs here, but typically a cruiser group will only spawn 1 NPC if it's just a single player playing the mission, which is going to be the vast majority of times. So just to now we can reskin any of these NPCs as we want. So I'm going to go ahead and find a nice little do like a freighter medium. And since I don't know exactly right now which of these NPCs will spawn, I'm just going to go ahead and reskin them all. And it's one thing to remember is that working in the Foundry can often be time-consuming.
Yes, it can. A lot.
Okay, so I've reskinned the whole group. You'll notice that the names have all changed to the name of the NPC contact I used, which is generic freighter medium. Unfortunately, this means that when the freighter shows up, it'll say generic freighter medium, which is not a particularly in-fiction name for it. So I'm just going to name it Federation Freighter. And since I didn't bother to find out which of these is spawning, I'm just going to go ahead and rename all of them. And if there, for some reason, more than one player is in the group, more freighters will spawn.
And just as a quick note, for copy and pasting, it's Control V, Control C, or Control C for copy, Control V for paste.
Yes.
And anytime you want to do that operation, it's those keys, and that is one of the single most useful little utilities that there is in the Foundry.
There's also Control X, which removes a piece of text so that you can paste it somewhere else.
Yeah, that's
also objects too, and that's why it can be really useful, especially when you're creating larger spaces.
Yeah, I haven't tried it, but try Control A. Just like stick the cursor in a text box, hit Control A to see if it will highlight all of the text in that text box.
It does.
Yeah, so the usual shortcut should work.
Mm-hmm.
They're also up here in the edit menu, but Control CV is just way faster. Okay, so we've got our little scene that we're going to stumble on. And because I don't want these guys to be fighting too soon, I'm actually going to go ahead and put in a place marker here. All right. Yep, I'm going to lead a little bit more. Okay, that should do it. And so I can just set that up to the objective to... And you know what, just for completion's sake, so it's consistent, I'm going to go ahead and put one here too. Okay. All right, so what else do we need for this scene? I think that's all we're going to need. We're actually going to have to go back into the story tab here and build out our objectives.
Do we want to change the backdrop?
Good point. Okay, so it's by default stars only, which I personally consider to be like one of the most boring backdrops ever. So
also, stars only is something that doesn't it just like automatically throw that in, even if you're using a map that is a copy of a mission map, even if the
Yes.
mission map has a different one?
Yeah, Stars 1 is literally the default for everything. So Trimble actually has a backdrop already because it's a cryptic mission. So I'm just going to go ahead and use that one. It is actually possible to customize it, and you can actually pick the backdrops where the sun is and all that good stuff. But sometimes it's just quicker to work with one of the stock ones, and there are actually a ton of really good options.
Yeah, I've actually taken to only using stock because one of the problems with the custom maps is that you cannot. There are options to change the lighting which don't work. So
yeah,
that's
they broke a couple of years ago, and unfortunately, they've never been a high enough priority to get fixed.
so for a lot of the sort of the main visual effects on a space map, which is basically how your ship looks in space. Yeah, that's sort of stuck in a muddy, sort of dark blue. So that's just something to consider when selecting what'll work best for your mission. Do take a look at those default options because they might, with a few compromises on the backdrop, really have the look and the feel that you really want.
Yeah, not to mention, I mean, even though they come from existing missions or in some cases missions that used to be in the game, it's just the backdrop, so it only defines some of the visual aesthetic of the map. So really, you can get a ton of unique space maps even with just a stock backdrop. Okay, so I think I've got everything down that I'm going to need. So let's go ahead and go to the story tab, and we're going to lay out our objectives for this map. All right, so first off, we're going to go ahead and put down a reach marker and have the player approach Trimble 4. And waypoint here, we're going to have it set to automatic because we want to show where the waypoint is. And we are going to select our marker we placed around the first planet earlier. Reach text is basically this flyby text that will come up once they reach the reach marker. It can be handy in some cases. In this case, we don't really need it since we're going to have objectives telling them what to do next. All right, and we're going to throw an interact and have it have them scan the area. We don't really need a waypoint at this point because we've already should have gotten them close enough to see the interact. So I'm going to go. Oop, guess it doesn't let you use planets. All right. For this, then we need an invisible object.
I have to point out that we don't always know or don't always remember every single nuance of the Foundry, but you will see the benefit of us troubleshooting and figuring out what does work when we encounter something that doesn't work.
All right, so since I can only make my invisible object so big, I'm going to go ahead and move my reach marker. And let's see. Okay. Okay, so the fun thing with the invisible objects is obviously that they can't be seen at a while being played. So they are great for just general things that you need to interact with.
It it's definitely a useful feature. What you can do with them is that if you need to do a particular objective, so say scan a planet, well, you don't necessarily need to be in a particular location to do that. You just have to be in the region of the planet. We can use that objective for is to, well, that object for is to set that up. So you place this object in a region of space, indicate where the player needs to go. They go there, and then in the objective for the interact, you can set it so that you play the scanning animation. In space, this is useful, but it can be very, very useful in ground if you need the player to do something. So to fix an object, to tap their communicator, to do so, like to play a lot of animations. This is a great method for doing that. The one note is that in space, there is going to be a small little box around that interact. A little reticle in white with the name of the object. So it's key that you need to rename it in space. For some reason, though, in ground, that doesn't happen, or at least I don't think it happens. So slightly different rules apply, but they generally have the same principle, where you set up the interact objective, set up that invisible object, and you can stage that action using that without having to necessarily tie yourself down to another type of physical object.
All right, so we can choose an animation for the player to carry out. So kind of like an emote. We have a number of options here. I'm going to go with scan space. Duration medium should be enough. I don't want to make it too long. Okay, and so let's see. We should probably put in some dialogue. So let's fill out a few. So this is going to be a dialogue that that pops up as soon as they enter the map. I'm going to try and keep it as brief as I can for this demonstration.
We should proceed to Trimble 4, or the 4th planet.
Okay, and I'm actually going to have one of the bridge officers say this. I don't know. I think a science officer would most likely be the.
Yeah, for anything that involves sensors and scanning, I generally use a science officer. Tactical, combat, enemies, that sort of thing. Engineering, something's going on that requires that technical opinion. It's all very loose, but you generally do want to stick to what was portrayed in the show because you are building missions for Star Trek fans. I guess if all else fails, do tactical. But science,
funny.
I think in this case, is a pretty good option.
Another thing that I've sometimes done is to, I guess you could say, find reasons to have the 3 different branches talking and not just have the same one do the entire talking. Like,
Yeah.
you know, like you scan something and your tactic, like say you're scanning an abandoned ship. Your tactical officer will talk about whether it has functional weapons. Your science officer might talk about whether it has life support, and your engineering officer might talk about whether it has its warp core running or something.
Yeah, and I've played missions where just for some particular reason, a lot of the dialogue came up with the engineering officer, and even though in each individual instant it's something that the author probably could have justified, having the same bridge officer come up and up and up again, it's going to be pattern that you'll eventually notice. So shifting things around generally is a pretty good thing.
And even
that,
if you'll notice they did it even on the shows where they just because for instance a communication comes in. Now normally Worf would handle it, but sometimes the con officer would handle it, or Data for some random reason. And I think a lot of times that was just so that they could prevent from things becoming too routine.
But well, for one way of putting it, Data didn't have anything else to do in that scene, so
Yeah, so I mean, it's just to kind of keep things balanced.
And the
All right.
reminder too on the bridge officers that you have two options: away team and ship. It doesn't particularly matter, but it will give preference to officers stationed in the player's ship slots or the bridge officer slots or in their away team. So that's the difference there. It'll still refer to one of their officers, but it'll give priority for people who really have made a point on selecting a given officer for certain
in certain
positions.
circumstances, you can actually use it to have two of the players' science officers talk to each other. But this is not reliable because you never know whether the player is going to use the same science officer for both their bridge and away team.
All right, so before I forget too far, I do need to put in some text for the entry dialogue. So this will be when the player approaches the Trimble system from sector space. A quick little dialogue will pop up. This doesn't need to be complicated. And it can be just as simple like, would you like to approach the Trimble system? Now, the thing to remember about these dialogues is the button here is both the text for the button that they have to click on to initialize the dialogue and the button in the dialogue. So it actually get used twice. I know this kind of isn't a rules per se, but I've noticed a lot of authors will do this, and it's actually not a bad thought, and they'll just call this first button here begin, and then in quotes the title of the mission, which we haven't come up with yet, so I'll just call it. And that's really nice because sometimes if they've come up to a door that they already have another mission for, you'll get a bunch of buttons that you can't tell apart. So you can't tell which button is for your mission and is for somebody else's mission, is for that cryptic mission. And so having that
sector
begin
control too.
Yeah. So
creative labeling is important.
Yeah. So begin title of mission is a great way to differentiate your mission from any other missions they happen to have at that door. Okay, so we are up to as far as they've scanned Trimble 4. And let's go ahead and bring up the science officer again. Let's have the science officer say, I'm detecting faint subspace. Let's just say a faint warp trail. It leads in the direction of Trimble 5. In this case, since I'm kind of leading them off on a another leg of the mission, I like to add in a bit of mission info text. So I can proceed to Trimble 5 and go ahead and stick it in the mission info text. Okay, so we need another reach marker. They're on their way to Trimble 5. We need to detect when they approach the second reach marker I have here around. I'm actually going to change this guy, move him here. Take down his. That'll do. And that'll just narrow it down exactly where they're supposed to proceed. I still want to keep it nice and large enough so that they can't accidentally miss it. Especially when it comes to the up and down. It's possible for a player to kind of work their way like above or below, in which case they could be missing.
Well, this is another situation where I like to keep in mind that if you have an object or at the very least a blinking light at the location that they're supposed to go to, it helps people find it. It's actually something that's come up in cryptic missions once or twice, is they'll have this point you're supposed to fly to on the map, and if you get, shall we say, distracted, you might have a very hard time finding the spot on the map.
Okay, so once they get to the reach marker, I'm going to go ahead and I've already used the science officer a lot, so I'm going to go ahead and have the tactical officer jump in and say, sir, I'm detecting a Fed. Sir, I'm detecting a Federation freighter on sensors. She appears to be under attack by Orion raiders. Which brings us to our next objective, which is to kill the Orions. So defeat Orion raiders. There's our red and squadron we placed. Let's go ahead and do a dialogue with contact next. So this is after we defeat the Orions. We can do a dialogue with contact, and we can actually. Oh, I guess not.
We haven't placed anyone on the map yet.
Oh, you're absolutely right, because he's not a. We can't use a dialogue contact because he's not a contact. But in the off chance that our lovely freighter is somehow destroyed, we should probably stick a NPC contact there anyways.
And it's also a good opportunity to show off the things you can do with states.
Very true. But it's going to have to wait for the next time, as we are out of time for this episode. But next week, we will pick this up where we left off and dive deeper into state transitions, as well as finish up our space map and give it a good trial run. So stay tuned. For tonight, though, we will bid you all good night.
Good night.
Good night.
Goodbye.